Hello and welcome to our today's webinar. My name is Göran and I will guide you through our today's event. And I'm glad to have Thorsten again with me for another webinar from Thinktecture. During the next 45 to 60 minutes, we will have a close look into Azure Arc and how to make use of it. But before handing over to Thorsten, I need some moments of your attention to have all information you need to make the most out of our today's event. Let's say it like that. It's a little more understandable. I prepared some slides, so I'm trying to get fast through them. Well, please feel free to chat with us, leave us a note, say hello from where you're attending. Yeah, please make use of the chat. It's a function you should use. Well, we got a Q&A section. You can place there some questions you run into during the webinar, or maybe you've already prepared. So please feel free to enter them in the Q&A section. We will have a look later after Thorsten's talk. A popular question during nearly every webinar is, will there be a source for the video recording, code, slide deck, additional content like cheat sheets or whatever? Yes, you will receive an email afterwards, after we prepared the video recording for you, with all the information you need to recapitulate the webinar and the content. One special thing we prepared for you is that you can have some conference feeling like exchange with Thorsten. The idea behind this is that in normal times, non-COVID times, you would have the possibility to meet Thorsten during different some international conferences where he's sharing his knowledge on stage. And sometimes you find him drinking a coffee or a beer, and you can chat with him and exchange some ideas or play some questions. Well, as you experienced, surely, is that during the current time, conferences are most of the times digital, video conferencing and so on. And there's a lack of face-to-face communication and exchange. So we prepared something special for you. You can register for an expert one-on-one with Thorsten, where you can talk to him, exchange some ideas, play some questions like you would do while drinking a beer together at the bar after a live event. And maybe you can bring your questions you don't want to share public, like here in the live webinar or later in the recording. So I slide in the link for the registration. Just pick a time of the day you want to make use, and I will reach out for you to discuss the details, like the meeting notes and so on. Okay, and it would be great if you can leave us some feedback. And if you have to leave earlier than the webinar ends, please leave the webinar by using the 3 dots in the upper right, and via the context menu exit webinar, then you will be forwarded to our feedback page. If you stay until the webinar ends, you will be forwarded automatically. And please leave us some feedback. We would really appreciate some feedback. This really helps us to improve. And well, that's all for now. From my side, Thorsten, I will hand over to you. The stage is yours. I will be back later after your talk, and after that we will have a look at the questions. Okay.
All right. Thanks for the introduction, Björn. So quick PSA from my side. So we did a tech check in advance of the talk, and we recognized that my audio is a little bit crappy, so sorry for that, but we weren't able to fix that 2 minutes before the talk. Yeah, so my name is Thorsten. I work as a consultant with Thinktecture, and today I want to guide you through some of the concepts and do some hands-on with Azure Arc, especially with Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. So let me quickly share my screen. All right, so you should now see my screen, or at least it should start appearing. Let me quickly switch that one, and yeah, So there we go. Yeah, as said, I'm a consultant with Thinktecture here in Germany, mainly focusing on cloud-native technologies and patterns, leveraging Azure as a cloud platform using Kubernetes. And yeah, I'm very deep in infrastructure as code, so Terraform or Project Bicep, the new DSL for provisioning Azure resources from Microsoft. That are things that got my attention too. Most important thing over here is obviously the mail address. So if you have any questions regarding the topic we are looking at today, don't hesitate, just reach out. All right. So I've tried to create a small agenda for today. So first we will look at what Azure Arc actually is, what it offers, and what the intention is, and why Microsoft came up with Azure Arc at all. And then we will look into Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes in a bit more detail. So we will focus on things like onboarding, doing inventory, monitoring capabilities, governance, and we will quickly touch or talk about GitOps integration with Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. Last but not least, we will take a look at, okay, what's possible with Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. What are the potentials that this service gives you as a user, and how it compares to other or similar solutions or projects or services that are available. All right, so as said, Azure Arc is a service offered from Microsoft. It's part of the Azure product suite, and it was initially announced during Ignite 2019. It was a CEO announcement, so Satya Nadella announced the general idea of multi-cloud patterns, where you have your cockpit sitting in Azure, reaching out into different cloud vendors' infrastructure, or even if you are running Kubernetes or services on the edge or in your private data center, you could integrate them right now seamlessly with your existing or perhaps existing Azure infrastructure. And the advantage of that is, or the idea of that is, that Azure gives you a centralized place where you can dive through all the metrics and get an overview of your overall infrastructure footprint, no matter where it runs. Technically, Azure Arc is brought into Azure itself by leveraging Azure Resource Manager. So that's the, let's say, new or the default way of how Azure treats resources like services in the cloud. So perhaps if some of you are using Azure for quite a long time, then you know all the classic services like web roles, worker roles that we were using. I think it's almost 10 years ago or so. And at some point in time, they came up with the idea of Azure Resource Manager that brings some let's say, common functionality that were available for all services that rely on Azure Resource Manager. For example, Azure Resource Manager offers all the capabilities through an API. Technically, it's an HTTP API with Azure Active Directory authentication in front, and we use different management tools like the Azure Portal, Azure CLI, Azure PowerShell to interact with the Resource Manager. But it's not only accessing, and doing CRUD on services like creating a new SQL database or creating a container registry or so. There are also functionalities built into Azure Resource Manager, like, for example, resource tagging and stuff like that. So all the services that rely on Azure Resource Manager participate from those features being added by Resource Manager itself. And what Microsoft now came up with is a connector. So they use Azure Resource Manager as, let's say, the basement, right? And they allow us to bring in external resources, not only Kubernetes, on that level. So by adding the external resources on the resource manager level, we will immediately get all those features that are exposed by Azure Resource Manager. So if we, for example, as we will do in a couple of minutes, integrate an external Kubernetes cluster into our Azure subscription, we will see it as it will be a first citizen Azure resource, no matter if it runs in AWS or if it runs in DigitalOcean, as it will do in our sample. So that's how they integrate, or how they get that working and achieve that on the Azure Resource Manager. Azure Arc is a suite of services, right? So there are actually 4 sub-services available. So you can use Azure Arc to onboard existing servers, no matter if it is a Windows server or it is a Linux server. Then you can govern them. You can do some inventory on them. You could enforce or harden them using Azure Policies, Azure Security Center, Azure Defender, all those great products that we all know and love. And we could also, instruct state configuration for external services. So like you're able with Azure Virtual Machines. Then there's Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes, which we will look at right now. And there are two other services. First, let's pick the Azure enabled SQL Server, which allows you to govern and manage your external SQL Server investments. The cool thing about Azure Arc enabled SQL Server is that Azure Arc is able to verify, validate, and harden your SQL Server connections and apply or give you best practices configuration recommendations, right? So you could use Azure Arc to harden existing SQL Server deployments, let's say on-premise. And Azure Arc enabled data services is again a container, let's say container-based approach to, for example, create distributed Postgres services or so. So you could bring in compute power from on-premises or other or different cloud vendors and build a kind of hybrid services. Actually, from as far as I know right now, mainly focusing on database-related things like Postgre and so on and so forth, or SQL, but it's definitely worth checking out. So the last, or the services I mentioned, like enabled SQL Server and Azure Arc Data Services, they are still in preview. For regular servers and Kubernetes, we hit GA, so general availability, a couple of weeks ago for Kubernetes and already a couple of months ago for Azure Arc enabled servers. So that should give you a brief overview of what Azure Arc is and what you can do with it from a 10,000 foot view. Okay, so let's dive into Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. So obviously we can bring in external clusters. The interesting thing is over here that Azure will deploy certain containers into your existing Kubernetes workloads, and they will use outbound connections, outbound SSL-based connections to the Azure management plane. So basically, your service, you don't have to put any, let's say, ingress firewall exception to allow Azure, monitor and interact with your cluster. It's more that the components being deployed to your Kubernetes cluster will reach out to the Azure management interface. And to do so, there are obviously some endpoints that you have to whitelist for egress traffic. But once you've done that, then Microsoft will send all the information encrypted to Azure itself, and all information is stored in Azure Cosmos DB instance, obviously tenant aware, and data is encrypted at rest as it should be. So speaking of onboarding, how to bring in your clusters into Azure using Azure Arc. Azure Arc, although it's general available, it has a set of supported regions. So during preview, we just had, I think, West Europe and East US. And if I remember correctly, right now we're able to spin that up in up to 10 or 12 regions. So the link is in the slides. Just double check if supported region works for your for your cloud strategy and your cloud architecture. On top of that, Kubernetes or Arc-enabled Kubernetes supports a bunch of or many different Kubernetes distributions. Microsoft launched a program for Kubernetes distribution vendors to get a certified label, right? So that they seamlessly integrate and support Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. Basically, their overall goal is to support all CNCF, so Cloud Native Compute Foundation, managed or approved the Kubernetes distros. But it's definitely worth checking out. All the famous Kubernetes distros that are available are already kind of supported, but before you actually onboard your clusters, you should check against those two lists if everything is working as expected. All right, so let's jump into onboarding external clusters. So I will bring up not the Azure portal. Let me bring up the other one, this one. No, there we go. So I have created two clusters right here in DigitalOcean. So actually it doesn't matter where they run. It's DigitalOcean give me the possibility to quickly spin up new Kubernetes clusters, almost as easy as it is in Azure. But we have two clusters over here, right? So we have a development cluster, we have a production cluster, all being provisioned this morning. So fairly new and fresh. And the idea is to onboard those into, or to bring those into Azure using Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. All right. There are different ways how you can achieve that. You could obviously use your identity or your user account and browse through the portal to onboard a cluster. And I did onboard already the development cluster over here. But there's another way. You could bring in a service principal, and that's also everything's described and documented on docs.microsoft.com. So you can bring in a service principal and give him or assign corresponding roles to that user, so that the service principal is able to onboard the external clusters, right? There's dedicated role. Let's quickly check into, let's say, create role assignment, and if we look for Arc enabled Kubernetes cluster Arc on Azure Arc onboarding, that's the role that you have to assign to that service principal. So I did that already. Let me quickly browse through the role assignments, and we see there is an Azure Arc Thorsten, so that's the service principal I created, and it has this role assigned on the scope of that subscription, and it's inherited down to my desired resource group. Besides that, we will, depending on the features that you want to use with your external cluster, you have to assign additional roles to that service principal. But overall, it's a good practice to use a service principal in contrast to using your identity, so that you could script onboarding like tens or hundreds or thousands of Kubernetes clusters. Don't know how many you're managing. So once we've that achieved, we have to bring in some functionalities into Azure CLI if you want to script it using Azure CLI. So I've prepared already a small repo that we will share afterwards. And you could browse through that, but let me quickly go to the onboard Kubernetes and we talk briefly about that. So right now there are 2 extensions available that you can install on your machine if you have installed Azure CLI. So that's connected K8s and K8s configuration. Although if you have, although they are around for a couple of months, or let's say a little bit more than a year, you should definitely verify if they are current. So if not, just check extension update. And we have to register several providers to get actually access or to being able to use Azure Arc in the scope of your subscription, right? We can do that with AZ provider register commands in Azure CLI, and we could also verify using the show subcommand over here. So that's so the basement that we need. Okay, so then I check, obviously, if the service principal has corresponding role permissions. So I just print out all the role permissions or the role assignments. And once we're cool with that, Azure Arc assumes that you have kubectl installed on your machine and that the current context of your kubectl points to the desired external Kubernetes cluster. So that's something you have to configure up front. So you have to bring your connection configuration onto the machine that will onboard the external clusters. So I quickly, print all the available context to the terminal. Then the user, if you run that script, you are able to switch to the desired Kubernetes cluster. And then we ask for a human readable name. That's how the Azure Arc resource will be named in Azure Portal or in Azure itself later on. Then, and that's the important thing, because normally I use Azure CLI with my user account. I log in explicitly with the underlying service principal, right? So I say, okay, log into the tenant ID and, set the subscription to the desired subscription ID. Once we've done that, and you can see AZ connected K8s, that's actually the command that we use to bring in the external cluster. And bringing in an external cluster means nothing more than deploying certain artifacts to your Kubernetes cluster, and on the other hand, interacting with Azure ARM API to create or to provision that Azure ARM resource in Azure. All right, so let's give it a try. So I have installed right here in my VS Code the Azure CLI extension, which gives me, a nice, if I would switch my keyboard to US, because otherwise I'm not able to work, which should give me in a second some kind of IntelliSense over here, so I can browse through the commands and also through the commands that I added by installing those extensions to Azure CLI. So we want to connect to onboard a new Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes cluster. And let's quickly cycle back to the portal and check the naming pattern, external K8s, okay, external K8s, and let's call that one obviously production. And we want to assign it to resource group. So let me quickly copy that one. All right, and I guess we can add some tags to show, the integration with Azure Resource Manager capabilities. So let's say com.thinktecture.owner equals Thorsten Hans at thinktecture.com. Let's stick with that one for now. Oh no, let's take another one. Let's say vendor equals DigitalOcean, and let's say location equals, and I guess that one I spun that up in, I think it's Frankfurt. yeah, it's Frankfurt FRA, and we can see that over here. Settings, I guess it's settings somewhere. Yeah, I can see it is in Frankfurt by looking at the name. Okay, so let me quickly cycle back to this one. Location, let's say this is Germany. All right, so let's copy that one. And over here in my terminal, I am already logged in with Azure CLI. So if I do an AZ group list, we should just see one resource group, because that service principal just has access to my webinar demo resource group over here. Let's paste in that command and let's give it a try. Okay, so it's checking if the Helm, oops, there's already a Kubernetes cluster, the Kubernetes cluster you're trying, yeah, okay. Mentioned before, but didn't check it. CDL config get context. As you see, I'm still pointing to development, and Azure recognized, hey, this one is already onboarded. So let's say kubectl config use context. And let's use the production cluster, and let's give it a try again. There we go. So it's checking if Helm is installed. Helm is like the package manager in the Kubernetes ecosystem that allows us to easily deploy complex applications to a Kubernetes cluster, and Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes makes use of that one to bring in all the required containers and components into our production cluster right now. So this will take a couple of seconds, and once finished, we should see our Kubernetes being displayed over here in Azure Portal. So let's quickly cycle to Azure Portal, and let's hit refresh. And there we see there's a production cluster. Don't know if it's already finished. No, it's still in the state of connecting. But we see those two tags are inherited from the Azure resource group. I have policy that's achieving that one. But vendor DigitalOcean, location Germany, that's what I specified as part of the command. So they are being assigned already. And let's quickly check if the connection is established. Not yet. It's still working. Still working on it. Okay, let's give it another second. But obviously, as you can see, onboarding external Kubernetes cluster is fairly simple, right? You just have to bring in the extensions and register the providers for your Azure CLI or for your Azure subscription. And you should definitely use a service principal, or if you're using an Azure virtual machine to onboard all your clusters, you could rely on a managed service identity. I think you could rely on a managed service identity. Not 100% sure. At least that's for Terraform. Maybe I'm mixing up things, but yeah, using service principal is obviously the better idea than to rely on your human, your own Azure AD account, right? So okay, there we go. We got some nice table output over here that confirms that the cluster has been onboarded. And we already get some basic information like, okay, the external cluster is running Kubernetes version 1.20.2, and the agent, so the Azure Arc agent that's being deployed into the Kubernetes cluster, is running in version 1.1.0. Okay, let's have a quick look at the Kubernetes cluster, kubectl get namespaces. So we see there's an Azure Arc namespace being created 2 minutes ago. Okay, let's quickly browse for that one. kubectl get po-n Azure Arc. And as you can see, there are a couple of interesting things already running in the cluster that are being provisioned by Azure Arc, by actually onboarding the cluster. Microsoft uses or heavily relies on existing and well-proven or battle-proven patterns in the Kubernetes ecosystem. So we have, for example, we have Flux. If you're already familiar with GitOps, they're using Flux to ensure that that continuous deployment into external clusters can be achieved. We can bring in Gatekeeper and things like that, but we'll see that in a couple of seconds. So once all those bits and bytes are being provisioned to our cluster, we're able to use it as any other first citizen resource in Azure. And that's what we want to do right now. So obviously we can use Azure CLI, to ask for all the external Kubernetes cluster right now. We can, add additional tags to the cluster. We will do that in a minute. And a fairly interesting thing, we can do inventory using Azure Resource Graph, right? So we can write some KQL queries and to do some inventory and get insights actually from the external clusters to, get a view of what's going on. All right. So assigning tags. I mean, we can. For example, we could use AZ tag update and merge in new tags or replace, let's say, the individual scope over here. But we can, say com.thinktecture.project, and let's say that's Thinktecture webinars, and let's apply that one. All right. So it takes a couple of may take a couple of seconds until it's actually visible in the list of all tags again. Let's go to that one. There it is already, but on the overview, it may take a couple of seconds because the portal is heavily caching all the information. So yeah, we should see that popping up in a couple of seconds. All right, so maybe you have noticed that I already prepared some kind of dashboard over here, which is a great use case for Azure Resource Graph, right? So we could, if you aren't familiar with Azure Resource Graph, just look for Resource Graph. I had it already here in the recent services. So let's jump into that one. And once you have connected your services, you could ask. You could use Azure Resource Graph to ask for them, right? So we have resources. Let's quickly bring that in over here. Oops. And let's give it a shot. And then we see which data is available for all the resources. And one of it is obviously the resource group. So we can filter for the resource group equals what was it? RG dev THHA RC, and let's bring that one. So we see all the resources from that resource group right now. Let's bring on this one. Let's say and type equals. Run that one again, and so we get our external Kubernetes over here, and we can pipe that one to the count, not the method. Let's say this one. We get 2 of them. Okay, let's take this one. We will come back later to that. Let's bring up the dashboard again. All right, so let's edit the dashboard. Let's say add a new. Where is it? Resource graph grid, no. Security metric, just looking for the proper. Tile, not able to find it over here. Maybe we can just say add to dashboard, pin to dashboard. Yeah. Okay, easy one. Yeah, let's pin it to that one. Let's go to dashboard and we see it over there. Let's edit it and let's say bring it up over there. And I think we can rename it. Save. Now, when I click on the grid right now, then I have to save it. There's a save button. I have my iPad sitting in front of it. Anyways, we can save it. Don't find a. I'm not able to locate the save button right now. And we could rename the query to say, okay, we have that amount of external clusters sitting in our resource group at that point in time. Maybe at some point in time we query across all the available resource groups. Okay, let's jump back to resource graph, because we can dive into the resources even deeper. So let's again bring up the script we had, and let's work on that a little bit. So we can, for example, say extend vendor equals toString, and we could say tags.vendor. Okay, so I've added the vendor tag manually, so that's a tag I added. And let's get rid of this one, and let's say project name and vendor. And we should get a list saying that we have all our clusters are onboarded from DigitalOcean. Okay, so that's fairly simple. We could obviously use that one again and say location. So that's a custom location. That's where we say, okay, this cluster is running over there, and it's not the Azure location. Yeah, we have to ask for the name, run query. Okay, and so we can build our own view on the data. Let's say extend Kubernetes, or let's say K8s version equals properties dot, I think it's Kubernetes version. And let's ask for that one too. And you see, we get even more details. And right now we're, asking for actual properties that are pulled from the external cluster. And let's say node count, properties, total, I think it's total node count. And let's bring in the node count, and boom, there we go, run query, total node count free. Okay, let's do the check. We head over to terminal and we say, let's clean up, kubectl get nodes. There we go. And we see this cluster has 3 nodes, sorry for that. And kubectl config use. No, I'm not used to write kubectl at all, because I have an alias called K. kubectl config use context, and let's say I want to look at development, and let's say kubectl get nodes, and the development cluster is built off from 2 nodes. Let's quickly switch back to production over here. Prod. All right. So you can see we can drill into the data. Obviously, we can use other KQL fancy stuff like grouping and time series measurements and stuff like that. But that's all based on the data that we actually got from the containers being deployed to the Kubernetes cluster while onboarding them, right? But there is more. I mean, having those insights is already great, and we can use that to do some kind of inventory. However, Azure Arc offers way more. So let's cycle through that one. Let me quickly check the clock. Okay, we're good in time. We have, maybe you're familiar with AKS, so Azure Kubernetes Service, right? Azure Kubernetes Service offers seamless integration into Azure Monitor. And to do so, Microsoft created a so-called solution that's called Container Insights. And Container Insights is, let's say, an extension that's being deployed to Log Analytics Workspace, which is part of the Azure Monitor family. And we can make use of that also with Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. So basically OMS agents. So that's think of it of a metric and log shipping container being deployed to the external cluster. That's again leveraging talking from your cluster to Azure endpoints and sending metrics and information about the cluster in an encrypted way into the Azure Log Analytics workspace. And Azure Container Insights gives you a great, user experience when it comes to diving through metrics, through logs that are gathered from the Kubernetes cluster. You can think of it like a Kubernetes dashboard on steroids, integrated right into your Azure cockpit. So yeah, we can leverage that also with Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. And a couple of months ago, when we were in preview phase of Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes, onboarding an external cluster was exactly the same as we saw a couple of seconds ago, but enabling monitoring capabilities was way more difficult. And since we hit GA with Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes, this one became frictionless, right? It's a one-liner again. It's getting everything in place, having a proper service principal pointing to the right Kubernetes cluster and so on and so forth. Once we have that in place, it's just a one-liner to get all those insights. So let's take a look at that. All right, so for demonstration purpose, I created two dedicated log analytics workspaces. One is already configured and connected to development, so that's my fallback. But there is a fresh instance that's called LAW Kubernetes Production Webinar. And right now the idea is to provision all the required bits and bytes to our production Kubernetes cluster running in DigitalOcean, and to get container insights up and running for this one, for the production cluster in the production log analytics workspace. Again, there is a script for that, and as you can see, it's all the plumbing, getting everything in place, blah, blah, blah. But the interesting thing is, once logged in, we say AZK as extension, because that's something that's that became available slightly or short time before hitting GA or with GA. We can bring in extensions into external clusters. And Azure Monitor Containers, that's one of the extensions that we can deploy to an external cluster. And as you can see, we just need an external name. That's the name how the Arc cluster is recognized also by Azure Portal. The resource group, obviously, the type of the cluster, that's a connected cluster. That's how they call Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. The extension type, and one configuration setting at this point in time, that's the resource ID from our log analytics workspace. Okay, so I don't want to, play around on that one. So let's say we have the cluster name. Let's grab that one first. Let's go to Azure Portal. The cluster name is this one, external KDS production. The resource group, obviously the script does all, guide you through all the things without, needing to cycle between your terminal and the browser. And we need the ID of the log analytics workspace. Let's go back to log analytics workspace. That's the desired one. Let's go to the properties tab. Somewhere is the properties tab. There it is. And there's the resource ID. Don't mess that up, because the workspace ID, that's something internally, right? We can load it. We can ask Azure CLI to give me details about a log analytics workspace by the ID. But if you want to access it with the full qualified ID, then we need the resource ID. So that's what we need at this point in time. And let's bring that up over here. All right, so I think we have everything in place. Let me quickly scan through it again. That looks good. Production, there we go. Okay, so let's grab that one too. Go to terminal and let's say, come on, there we go. Oh, client with object ID does not have the authorization. Great. Okay. So basically we got an unauthorized exception over here, right? That's because the service principal we are using that needs some permissions on our log analytics workspace. Okay, so let's go to Azure Portal and fix that quickly. We are on the log analytics workspace, and we go to access control, and let's say add role assignment. The script is checking that, obviously. Yeah, I think it's Azure Arc. Was it Azure Arc - Thorsten, I guess? Yeah, but that was it. And we have to specify the role. That was log analytics, I think contributor. Let me quickly check with the script. Bam, 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 bam. Over there. Log analytics contributor, yeah. Okay. We want to assign that to, yeah, to that source principal. There we go. Okay, role is assigned. This may fail again because it could take a time until it is provisioned. Come on. Please refresh your credentials. Okay, then let's log in again. AZ login. There we go. And let's say AZ account set subscription. I don't know if that's the right subscription ID. Properties. B3A. B3A. Okay, that's right. And let's fire that one again. Did I hit save? But it complains about the read permissions. Okay. I thought that contribute would also mean read arc. Save. We will try. Let's log in again. If not, I have to go to my prepared backup, but no worries. I think it should. Client, with client.
Yeah. Maybe you've chosen the wrong role. You said you wanted to add a role for the contributor, not for the reader.
Yeah, but I've added contributor a couple of seconds already ago. Log analytics contributor is set on the resource too. Policy insights reader should be maybe I need to wait a couple of seconds until role assignment is provisioned through the forest. But anyways, I've already onboarded it for the development cluster. So let's take a look at that. Basically, what we will get additional containers being deployed to the production cluster once that command has completed successfully. And then we should have access to the following. We should see an extension, being listed over here, Azure Monitor Containers installed, and we should have access to Monitor Insights. So what you see right now is just a view to the Container Insights solution being deployed to Log Analytics Workspace. And it gives us basically all the information we want to get from a Kubernetes cluster, right? We could take a look at the cluster overall, and we could dive even deeper. So we could dive into the nodes and see uptime and metrics, being gathered from several nodes, and we could drill into those. So, for example, let's say let's not say controllers, let's say containers, and we should see. We could also go away. There should be an Nginx. I have deployed several Nginx instances to that cluster. They are up and running. Obviously, it's bored in the cluster, but we can drill down. Let's say the controllers. Come on, Azure Policy, and at some point we should see our. Get rid of my iPad over there. There's my Nginx replication set, and we see 10 instances are requested and 10 instances are up and running. And then we can dive into the pod. Come on. can dive into the container. And we can dive into the pod. There's the link. And we could see the containers. And from there, I don't know if that view is actually offering, no, it's not offering. But we can also, forward all the logs from the containers to Azure monitors by just instructing OMS agent to scrape that logs too. All right, so let me quickly try that again because it should work. One last try. Come on, read on the scope of production. Yeah. Or the scope is invalid. No, the scope is not invalid. Using granted pro. Yeah. So one last shot. Okay, demo gods were not good. We're not happy with me today. Anyways, we saw integration with the development cluster. So we are able to bring in all the logs from the external cluster and to get telemetry. And maybe you saw it already in the dashboard. I was asking for the CPU usage of the development cluster and, created a kind of tile on my dashboard. And another great feature that Azure Arc allows you to do is to bring in Azure Policy support. So basically, we are able to deploy Gatekeeper 3, which is an admission controller for Open Policy Agent, into the external cluster. And by deploying that one and having that one connected back to Azure, we can just assign Azure policies or Azure policy initiatives onto our external cluster and have Azure, govern over the external cluster. Let's take a look at that. Again, let's go to the development cluster, and we could say policies. All right, and as you can see, I've already assigned a couple of policies. So we have the Azure Security Center default rule set, let's say it that way, which is a collection of, I don't know, hundreds of rules or hundreds of policies that are being, evaluated against my infrastructure. And it is not compliant at that point in time because I've not enabled Azure Defender, active threat protection services on my external cluster. So if I drill down into that one, come on. Okay, if I drill down into that one, we see that enable threat detection for Azure resources. They are not activated right now on my Arc cluster. So once I enable Azure Defender to govern over the external cluster, then I should get a green check mark and I should be compliant against those rules too. However, we can also assign other rules. Let's say we go to assign policy, we go to the policy definition, we ask for, let's say, Kubernetes policies, and there are, a lot of policies already being pre-deployed and or pre-created. Clusters should use internal load balancers, blah, blah, blah. Pods should use specific labels. Let's select that one. Let's enable that. Then we can choose how the cluster should be governed, right? We could say deny. That means if a pod in namespaces other than those three, can we add a label selector? And I have to double check the schema, blah, blah, blah. So we have the schema over here. And as you can see, it's fairly complicated. So we can basically, grab the schema. That's a property type object. The match labels is object. Then we have additional property string. Okay. Type object. Then we have match labels, and we say that's let's say app must be development, let's say app, let's say environment. Let's have that one. And list of labels. Let's keep that one. Enter the values for the custom array. Okay, cool. Quickly check this one. The list of labels to specify the ports in Kubernetes cluster environment. List of labels. Enter the values. Okay, I would suggest that one being this. Yeah. All right. And so the interesting thing over here is affect, obviously. So when we set that to deny, Azure Policy will prevent a pod being, or will instruct Open Policy Agent and Gatekeeper to prevent you from deploying a pod to all namespaces, excluding kubesystem, Gatekeeper, and Azure Arc, if a pod does not match, my desired label configuration. So that's the hard, let's say, rule, but we can run that one in audit mode, so we can, get an idea of how the overall footprint looks like in our external clusters. So running it in audit should be a good idea to get started. And once you get an idea of how that would impact your existing workloads, then you could switch from audit to deny at that point in time. And that said, let's cancel because I think that one is wrong. There are, hundreds of policies. You can build your own policies. And I think I've already added this one. Kubernetes service should be upgraded from non-Kubernetes, non-vulnerable Kubernetes version. And it takes obviously some time until all those rules are being enforced and governed and checked. So every rule has a kind of freshness interval where Azure Security Center evaluates the compliancy of that rule. So yeah, that's so we are able to govern and to harden external clusters using Azure Security Center and Azure policies. What we have to do to get that up and running is we have to again execute a simple script. So the Azure Policy add-on right now consists as an Helm chart being specified on Helm repository sitting in GitHub, and we have to bring in that repository. And once we have that repository in place, we can install it directly onto our Arc cluster. So you will also find that script in the repository. All right, last point is GitOps deployment. So basically, you can set up continuous deployment mechanisms for external clusters using GitOps. If you're not familiar with GitOps, you can think of it like continuous deployment, but in the other direction, right? So the Kubernetes cluster, you specify a Git repository and tell the Kubernetes cluster, hey, look at this Git repository. And once some activity happens over there, just pull the manifest or the Helm chart specifications and deploy them into the cluster. And the key difference is that your pipelines or your CI/CD system doesn't need to have the credentials to deploy into your Kubernetes clusters. On the flip side, the Kubernetes cluster needs some kind of authentication and authorization to your Git repository. And I prefer that way of deploying things because, I don't have to put sensitive connection information for all my Kubernetes clusters into a CI/CD system. So I'm pretty happy with the opposite direction. And Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes is using Flux in version 1. So Flux version 2 is right now under active development. And hopefully we see Azure adopting Flux version 2 quickly or as soon as that one hits GA. So I've added some links to concepts and how to get started with GitOps into the slide deck. And by that, I will come to the last part of the talk, and that's obviously possibilities, potentials, and alternatives. I think personally, for me, the biggest advantage is that you have a kind of cockpit that gives you a view over all your infrastructure, no matter where it runs. Right? You are still in. You did huge investments in on-premise infrastructure, and you deployed Kubernetes there at some point in time. You can keep that there. You just have to hook it up into Azure to get a seamless integration with existing cloud investments. On the other side, there is Azure Security Center integration, Azure Policies integration. That one is fairly important when it comes to govern and hardening external workloads. And by being able to provision Azure Defender into external clusters, you could harden the infrastructure even more, and you don't have to go into management consoles of Cloud A, Cloud B, Cloud C. So you just have your Azure portal as the single point of truth, let's say that way. And obviously, my bet is that Microsoft will allow integration with existing, let's say, PaaS or so platform as a service offerings, like for example, SQL Azure, even smoother, right? Obviously, you can just use SQL Azure, right? But my bet is that it's Microsoft is making the journey towards public cloud way smoother with Arc. So I think that's a transition that we're going to see in the upcoming months and years. But there are alternatives. Obviously, AWS has Outposts and Google has Anthos, and that are 100% competitors to Azure Arc. So depending on your cloud investments, depending on what you're using in cloud, if you're using AWS, it makes perhaps more sense to get Outposts in contrast to Azure Arc. But however, Azure Arc, Microsoft is always good when it comes to integration, when it comes to, provide some kind of structure that we all know and familiar with, like for example, resource groups and the way how role-based access control flows through subscriptions and stuff like that, that are concepts that are fairly related to how, let's say, ACL, so like file system access of is managed or has been managed on Windows for decades, right? So the concepts are fairly similar. And that's why I think Azure has an advantage over there compared to other cloud vendors. And one interesting service is obviously Rancher. Rancher is a vendor agnostic product. It's open source, and basically their job is, or their idea is to have such a cockpit for all your Kubernetes workloads. And my understanding is that maybe Azure Arc, AWS Outposts, Google Anthos, they use Rancher as a kind of blueprint, right? Because Rancher does all the things that we saw in Azure Arc and AWS already for quite some time. And on top of that, they can, bring in or bridge your authentication authorization to your on-premise Kubernetes cluster through a single tunnel. So maybe Rancher is also a good way to go. The disadvantage of Rancher compared to Arc is there is a managed offering, okay, but that's managed by some company. On top of that, if you want to deploy a Rancher, let's say, environment, then you have to manage the Rancher cluster again. And right here, we were looking the past hour, and that's the closing thing. We were looking at a fully managed service. I mean, we can automate it, we can integrate it if your role assignments are in place, not like mine. So that's the advantage. Always the advantage of relying on platform as a service and managed offerings compared to, managing services on our own. And with that, I wanted to say thank you to all of you. Thanks for tuning in. And you will find the Git repo on github.com /Thinktecture/Arc enabled KDS webinar April 2021. You don't have to note down the link right now. As Göran already said during introduction, we will send an email with all the details and pointing you to the proper places. All right, so I was looking at my screen all of the time. I wasn't able to follow the chat. Göran, did we get some questions?
Yes and no. Just
yes and no. Yes and no. Okay.
Yes, we got questions, but you will see them during your expert one-on-ones. We got some requests for that, so that's the yes part. The no part is that nobody has some ad hoc questions, so we are able to skip the Q&A part of today's webinar. But well, I think the questions are more complicated or more like a deep dive. So they're good situated in the expert one-on-ones.
Okay.
So just let me slide in the registration link again to make sure that you have it and
sure. All right.
So thank you again. I'm really happy to see how Azure Arc is developing. So I'm pretty sure we'll have it again on our agenda in the future. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, maybe demo gods are better with me next time. But anyways,
it's like the sound today. Last week we had some other struggles. So, well,
I don't know.
Happens.
Yeah.
Anyways, and it's not pre-recorded. It's authentic.
That's what I wanted to point out. It's live, right? All right. Cool.
Great. Okay. So from my side, thank you to all attendees, and have a great day. Stay safe. See you next time.
Stay safe. Stay healthy.